Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. There has been a lot of discussion lately about Jon Jones making his UFC heavyweight division debut, and in particular, a matchup between Stipe Miocic and Jon Jones for an interim heavyweight title. And I wanted to make a video about basically the entire heavyweight division situation, whether it be Jon Jones, Stipe Miocic, or Francis Ngannou. There's a lot going on within the heavyweight division right now, and there's been talk about a Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic fight. You know, a couple months ago, it was supposed to happen in September at UFC 279. Then there's talk now of it potentially happen at UFC 281 at Madison Square Garden in November. And now there's even talk about Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic for an interim heavyweight title taking place in December at UFC 282. And I wanted to make a video because I believe there is two potential outcomes for Jon Jones, Stipe Miocic, Francis Ngannou, the entire heavyweight division situation. And I believe both of these potential scenarios would be massive, shocking news to the MMA world. And I believe both of these situations have not really been talked about nearly enough. I haven't seen really anybody discussing how this heavyweight division could potentially play out. So before we get into any of that, you have Jon Jones, who last fought in February of 2020 against Dominic Reyes. And after this fight happened, a lot of people believe that Dominic Reyes was robbed of a decision win over Jon Jones, and there was talk of a rematch between Jon Jones and Dominic Reyes. Well, Jon Jones was having contract negotiations with the UFC, and eventually Jon Jones decided, you know what, I don't need the belt anymore. I'm going to relinquish the belt, and I'm not going to fight, and I'm going to eventually move up into the heavyweight division. And it's been teased for years that Jon Jones is going to move up to heavyweight, almost to the point that, you know, heavyweight Jon Jones is like a memeable UFC character, a mythical character at this point. But Jon Jones now has talked, you know, heavily for the last year and a half that he will be making his UFC heavyweight debut in his next fight and that he's putting on all this muscle. Meanwhile, in the UFC heavyweight division, you had Francis Ngannou versus Stipe Miocic at UFC 260, March of 2021. Francis Ngannou just flatlined Stipe Miocic to take the title off of him. And then you have Francis Ngannou, who, you know, just won the belt at the end of March of 2021. And next thing you know, the UFC is booking Derek Lewis versus Cyril Gane for an interim heavyweight title. You know, the UFC is prone to booking interim heavyweight title fights nowadays, I guess, because now Dana White has teased for the past few months that it could be Stipe versus Jon Jones for the interim heavyweight title, and there's been a situation going on with Francis Ngannou. So inevitably, Cyril Gane won the interim title over Derek Lewis last year. I believe it was UFC 265. And then at UFC 270, January of 2022, January of this year, we had Francis Ngannou versus Cyril Gane. Francis Ngannou comes in this fight. He has a knee injury, but he fights through it anyway, and he defeats Cyril Gane by unanimous decision. So I think a lot of people are wondering, you know, what's going on with Francis Ngannou? What's going on with the UFC? Why'd they book this interim heavyweight title fight? You know, even though Francis Ngannou had just won the belt a couple months prior. Well, what's going on with Francis Ngannou? And I have other videos on this. I'll link them down in the description. But Francis Ngannou wants to fight out his UFC contract. And the UFC does not like when fighters attempt to fight out their contracts. So what the UFC did is they tried to book Francis Ngannou to fight sooner than he was available to fight. And because he said no, they said, okay, we'll just make an interim title fight instead. And, you know, whether that hurts or helps Francis Ngannou, it is what it is. But that's why they booked it. And then in January at UFC 270, I made a video about this as well. I'll link it down in the description. There is no doubt in my mind that Dana White in the UFC was rooting for Cyril Gane to defeat Francis Ngannou because this was the last fight on Francis Ngannou's contract. Now, when you win and you're a champion, you're automatically extended, I think, for one fight or a year, something along those lines. There's so many, you know, stipulations in a UFC contract, especially for champions, that it's basically you're being held hostage at any point in time. But Francis Ngannou has a knee injury. So essentially, there's been talk that Francis Ngannou may wait out a year and then he's essentially out of his contract. The UFC would still have a matching, you know, clause. You know, if Francis Ngannou went and signed with another promotion, he would have to essentially bring that back to the UFC and the UFC could match it and keep him. But now we're kind of in a weird spot, and Dana White has said, well, we're probably going to book Stipe Miocic versus Jon Jones for an interim heavyweight title. And the reason I believe the UFC wanted to go with that is because if they are unable to negotiate with Francis Ngannou, who says he wants to box and all this and that, they could easily just elevate whoever wins out of Stipe versus Jones. They could elevate to the undisputed heavyweight champion. And essentially, even though it would be a little bit weird, especially if Stipe won, considering he just got brutally KO'd by Francis Ngannou, the UFC would at least have a backup plan for the division. And also, kind of crowning an interim heavyweight champion, takes away a little bit of negotiating power from Francis Ngannou. So there's been talk of this fight between Jones and Stipe, and it was originally, Dana White said they were targeting September, and then there was talk of it happening in at Madison Square Garden. And most recently, the most recent speculation has been for Stipe Miocic versus Jon Jones for the interim heavyweight title to be the main event of UFC 282 in December. That takes place in Las Vegas. Right now, we already have not announced, but it's being targeted. It's being reported by, legitimate sources that it looks like the UFC is going to book Yuri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 for the light heavyweight title on UFC 282. And there's some people saying, well, that would be the co-main event. The main event would be Stipe Miocic versus Jon Jones. But I started really thinking about it, and if you joined me for a live stream the other day, you understand what I'm talking about here, because I kind of told you my video idea that I'd be doing in the next few days. But when you start looking at that timeline, it doesn't really make sense, because Francis Ngannou's injured. He has the knee injury. He's going to be out 9 to 10 months. Well, when is his potential return date? And you start factoring all these different things, and it really doesn't make sense for it to happen in December. If it would have happened in September, that would have made a lot of sense. November's already taken by Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira for the middleweight title. I don't see them making that fight a co-main event. It's just not happening, even at Madison Square Garden. So the only possible landing spot for Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic would be UFC 282 in December. But you look at Francis Ngannou's ACL injury surgery. He had surgery in March. The timeline for his return was about 9 or 10 months. So that would leave his return around, December, January, February. So now if you book a Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic fight in December, and let's say the UFC works out their contract issues with Francis Ngannou, what's going to happen there? You're going to have an interim champion who just fought. Stipe Miocic is inactive as it is. He's fought like once a year for like the last 25 years. You're going to have Francis Ngannou, who's now freshly healed up and ready to go, and you're not going to, be able to give him a fight, because what's Francis Ngannou going to go defend his UFC heavyweight title? Meanwhile, you got an interim champion. I really don't think that makes sense. And this is one of the potential scenarios that I see happening, and this is what I think will happen. So you look at the division, and the only possible landing date is that December date for Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. And I do not believe we will see Jon Jones fight in 2022. I do not believe we will see Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic ever. I mean, there's always a chance. I don't believe we will see that fight. And the reason I say that is because if the only landing spot is in December, then it just doesn't make any sense, because Francis Ngannou is going to be ready to return in January or February. Latest I see Francis Ngannou returning, if the UFC is able to get a contract done with him, would be March. And if they fight in December, I mean, Stipe Miocic isn't going to be ready till, if he wins against Jon Jones, he's not going to be ready for the rest of the year, honestly. He only fights once a year. So best case scenario, he maybe fights in December of the following year. So it just doesn't make sense. So what I believe is actually going to happen, I believe the UFC will not book Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic, and I believe the UFC will work out their contract issues with Francis Ngannou, and I believe the main event of UFC 284 in February will be Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones for the undisputed heavyweight title, which will be absolute insanity. And the reason I say February is because I just don't think it's going to happen in January. UFC 283 is going to take place in Brazil, so I don't think it's super likely. They're not going to do Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones in Brazil. It's just not happening. So the most logical next date would be the February card. So it'll be either UFC 284 or UFC 285. We will get Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. Now, the other scenario that could play out is actually really terrible for MMA fans, because I would actually love to just have the UFC hold off and do Francis Ngannou, Jon Jones. But the other scenario is even worse, because if the UFC is unable to work out a deal with Francis Ngannou to get him back in the cage, then what we're left with is Stipe Miocic versus Jon Jones for the heavyweight title. And I believe if they figure, they're going to figure it out at some point that the Francis Ngannou contract situation isn't going to work. And I believe they will book Stipe versus Jones for the undisputed heavyweight title. And they'll probably strip Francis Ngannou, or they'll say Francis Ngannou vacated the title. But what sucks about that is I still don't believe they're going to put that as a headliner over Yuri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2. And again, UFC 280, UFC 281, and UFC 282 are already taken up. They already have their main events outside of 282, which is kind of a little bit up in the air. You know, it's been reported by legitimate sources they're working on Yuri versus Glover 2, but that's still a little bit up in the air. So I doubt, even if the UFC does decide to go with Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic, I still don't think that happens till February or March, the same as Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. So in that particular situation, we're kind of screwed because everyone has been operating under the assumption that we are getting Jon Jones versus somebody this year. He's going to make his heavyweight debut. I just don't see it happening. I don't think it's going to happen in December against Stipe. And if it does happen in December against Stipe, that's bad news for whatever's going on with Francis Ngannou and his contract situation, because there's no way they book that fight if Francis Ngannou is going to re-sign and be ready to go in early 2023. They just don't book that fight. So I really, truly believe if Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic gets booked for December, which I think is unlikely, it would actually be, and I would have a negative reaction to it, because that means that Francis Ngannou either isn't re-signing or, you know, he's going to be out till at least summer of 2023. And I want to see Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. So I think we will get Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones in February or March 2023. And that is a massive fight. I believe that's one of the biggest fights the UFC can book. You have, you know, Francis Ngannou, just look at the guy. I mean, absolute insanity, freak athlete, brutal KO power. He doesn't nearly get enough promotion by the UFC. It's crazy. They were promoting Brock Lesnar, you know, from the WWE, but look at Francis Ngannou. He's knocking guys dead. He's the champion, and they're not really even promoting him. But you have Francis Ngannou, who's one of the scariest fighters I've ever seen, versus the consensus light heavyweight GOAT in Jon Jones. And I think Dana White in the UFC knows, with the right promotion, that can be one of the biggest fights the UFC ever books. And that's why I believe, you know, at this point, they're going to hold off. If they could have, you know, used, you know, Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic at UFC 279 in September, you know, they probably would have done it. But now that it's kind of lingered around and it hasn't been booked, and, you know, whatever's going on behind the scenes with Jones and Ngannou's contract situations, and also Stipe Miocic has been notoriously difficult with the UFC as well, I think the UFC is just going to wait it out, and we are going to get Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones for the undisputed heavyweight title, and I cannot wait for that fight. That is one of my most anticipated fights ever. You know, that's a fight that I'm dying to see. So let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. You heard it here first. I believe the UFC will book Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones at UFC 284, February of 2023. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.